I chose this topic for this morning from all of the issues that you gave the week before Christmas, on Christmas Eve, and the Sunday after Christmas. There were many comments and many questions about families, and can families get along, and what about families that don't get along, and what does it mean that we have differences of opinion within our families of origin as well as our church family. Well, I chose that topic for today because today is Baptism of the Lord Sunday, and it is through our baptism that we become part of Christ's family and the family of the church. So please join me in silent prayer. Amen. I love the sculpture that is on the screen. I lived for 1 year during my internship year just in the country just outside of Oblong, Illinois. And there's also a Normal, Illinois. And so I remember one paper that I saw that was in a wedding announcement that normal girl marries oblong boy. So I've always linked oblong and normal in my mind. This sculpture is in Normal, Illinois, and it is called The Normal Family. And it's a sculpture by Sheila Ettinger. And yet this sculpture, isn't it beautiful, with the baby on the mother's lap, the little girl looking up dreamy to her mother. This sculpture is vandalized regularly. Because you can imagine, especially for young people trying to work through family issues, they look at the sculpture and either they love the sculpture or they look at that and they say, why isn't my family like this? And there's anger that it evokes for some people. So regularly, vandalism. Well, that's because our families were not usually the normal family. It would be more normal to consider the dysfunctional family the normal family, because all of us have stories and our families have stories. We don't have a clicker yet that I can use from here, and so I'm going to be telling Tyler to move the slides. So the next slide. But we're not alone in this dysfunctional family, because Jesus had a dysfunctional family. His family tree, and all of that in the Christmas tree, that's his family tree. Abraham would not have been considered the father of the year. What he did with Isaac, taking him up to almost be sacrificed, now we'd be calling Child Protective Services, right? Jacob, you've heard the stories of Jacob, and last week Pete spoke about Jacob and his family. Jacob was a scoundrel. Tamar, oh, if you don't know this story, you might want to go read it if you want to read something racy. It is one of the worst stories about relationships in the Bible, where she is rejected by husbands, and so she tricks her father-in-law. Rahab, a prostitute. David and Uriah together, Uriah's wife that he had the affair with, produced Solomon, all in Jesus' family tree. And then they weren't even all pure Jews. There were 3 of the women were Gentiles. Jesus' family tree is significant in that they were not all perfect people, and yet the product at the end was Jesus. Next slide. Well, we have families with backgrounds, maybe some of it we don't know as much as we know with Jesus' family. But we have families with stories. We have skeletons in our closet, like Jesus' family tree could be seen as the skeletons in Jesus' family. And yet, there are things that we know about families that can help us. One is that self-differentiation in a family is a very healthy and good thing. Self-differentiation, you can read the definition, the official definition on the screen. In family, self-differentiation is knowing where I stop and the next person begins. It is really having those boundaries, even between individuals, healthy boundaries. Recognizing that Dennis and I are married. You two are married, and yet you still are individuals. I'm always saying at weddings where they want the unity candle, that yes, the two candles come together and you light the middle candle, but you never extinguish the two side candles because you've come together and yet you're still individuals. Self-differentiation is so healthy. You look at the top picture and you see someone who's self-differentiated. Here he is with a group of people, set apart, a little bit different. The bottom one, oh, that is not good self-differentiation. And probably we've seen high school people who behave this way. I sewed my name on your shirts in case you forgot you're taken. When you have low self-differentiation in families, those are the families where there's violence very often. Men beating their wives because there is no self-differentiation. A wife is not allowed to be an individual. Next slide. So in a family that has high self-differentiation, it's like the picture on your left. It's that every family has a chronic level of anxiety. Every family does. No family has absolutely no chronic anxiety. Every family has some. In a family with high self-differentiation, where people know where one person ends and the next one begins, then the chronic anxiety, like water in a glass, is fairly low. In a family with low self-differentiation, where people are blurring the boundaries all over the place with each other, you can imagine that the anxiety in that family is like the glass on the right. Very high chronic anxiety. So when you add another anxiety, another issue, something else that happens in the family, when you add it to the glass of water, in a family with high self-differentiation and low anxiety, the water glow goes into the glass, the anxiety does, and it just slowly evaporates. It may raise the anxiety level a little bit, but that's it. It goes back down. In a family with low self-differentiation and high chronic anxiety, so the glass is almost full, what happens when you pour another anxiety in? It goes all over. It goes out on Facebook. It goes everywhere, which is sort of funny because when you look at Jesus' family tree and when you look at some of those families in the Old Testament in Genesis, there's not a lot of self-differentiation in those families. And so that's why, in my mind, even they did their Facebook version of the day. They're in the Bible. That's how high anxiety it was. They added another anxiety and everyone knew, even thousands of years later, we still know. Next slide. So, when you have a family with low self-differentiation and high chronic anxiety, everything is shared, not just viruses. If one person in that family is hurt and angry, then they're all hurt and they're all angry. There are no in-depth discussions unless every person who's in that family agrees. And when one person in the family makes a mistake, then it makes everyone in that family look bad. Is this making sense to you? It is. It's what we know inside, but it's helpful, I hope, to have this put out like this. Next slide. So a family with high self-differentiation and low chronic anxiety, if one is hurt and angry, others offer support and let the one learn. Discussions happen without having to reach a consensus or an agreement. They agree to disagree and to allow people to have their own opinions. People are allowed to learn from their mistakes without everyone rushing in to rescue them in their mind. Next slide. Well, our goal as Christians, our goal is to be like Jesus. Well, when you read the Gospels, you realize that Jesus was self-differentiated. He always engaged with the people around him, even though he did not always agree with them. He was surrounded by his disciples, his apostles, who obviously did not know what was going on. They truly did not understand who Jesus was until after his crucifixion and his resurrection. If you read the Gospel of Mark, you will see over and over that the disciples never got it right. They made mistakes. They did things they just couldn't figure out who Jesus was. And yet he remained engaged with them. He still respected them, but he spoke the truth in love to them. That is healthy differentiation. Next slide, Tyler. So what does all of this look like for our families? Well, I'm saying this because really the questions you asked were, why is it? What do we do when we have disagreements in our family at home? What do we do when we have disagreements with our church family? What do we do when we have different political beliefs from our families? How do I have a positive feeling, a positive relationship with my families? The biggest key is to follow Jesus' example and to be self-differentiated. It's to do something very Wesleyan. John Wesley had lists for himself, questions that he asked himself every day. We can do that with our families, to be very intentional and to look at what it means to be self-differentiated and to say, am I? Do I know the boundaries of my family? And to ask real questions of ourselves. And if we recognize that perhaps this is an area we need to work on, then we can choose to react differently. We can choose not to overreact. We can choose to step back and allow people around us to learn. We can choose not to be drawn into conflicts unless they're truly our conflicts to own. We can celebrate the differences within our families and celebrate the differences within our church. In a church that is not very self-differentiated, it's the same as the family, where if someone disagrees, if someone is different, then you don't want them sitting next to you. I mean, I would invite you, when you look around this room, I can guarantee that probably very few of us have the exact same beliefs. And in the United Methodist Church, that is seen as healthy. We don't all have to believe exactly the same to worship God together. Same in our families. We can celebrate the differences. And so we can support others in our families, but we support them with those healthy boundaries. Next slide, Tyler. So the good news, I think, is that even though our families are dysfunctional, even though there are probably very few families that are truly self-differentiated, that very low chronic anxiety, most of us are not fully self-differentiated, but we're also not fully in each other's business all the time. We're probably somewhere in that middle ground. The good news that I see, and I take especially from Jesus' family tree, is that even though we are flawed people, even though sometimes our families confuse those boundaries and we may not be self-differentiated, even though in the church sometimes we mess up, even though in the church sometimes we may be sitting next to someone that they're extra grace required people for us, even so, God can work through every single one of us. God can work through this church and every church. God can work through our families. I see that as really good news. Do you? And amen.